purpose of this initiative, and how we will progress over the coming weeks. This webinar series is part of IYAP's ongoing commitment to empowering young people and faith-based communities to act on climate change. By combining scientific knowledge with the ethical and moral insights drawn from various faith traditions, we aim to inspire and equip participants to make meaningful and sustainable actions. The program will cover a range of interconnected topics over several weeks, from environmental justice and policy to the role of traditional knowledge and youth activism. At IYAP, we believe that knowledge is the foundation for change. So that is why we are conducting today's session titled Faith and Ethics in Climate Policy, which is the fifth topic in our webinar series. This session will explore the topics of faith-based climate factors, ethics of climate advocacy, scope of the climate policy, and climate policy advocacy by faith-based climate actors. By delving into these important areas, we aim to deepen our understanding of the challenges we face and emphasize the urgency of the climate crisis. Together, we can strengthen our collective efforts to build a more just and equitable future. A quick note for our participants today: those who will attend 6 out of 7 webinars in this series will be awarded a certificate of recognition for their dedication for this program. So over the next week, we will cover themes such as circular economy and sustainable business models, and youth and climate activism, which will be our last 2 webinars. But for today, we are focusing on faith and ethics in climate policy. Today, we are honored to have Ms. Chiranti Senanayaka, who brings a wealth of knowledge and passion to our session. She is a distinguished development justice and governance advocate, an attorney at law, and a lecturer in international human rights and public policy. As the founder of HYPE Sri Lanka, she has demonstrated a strong commitment to social impact. Additionally, Ms. Senanayaka is a 2024 Youth Interfaith Leaders Fellow and a 2024 Faith for Our Planet Youth Interfaith Leaders Fellow. Her deep dedication to these causes make her the ideal speaker to continue our webinar series. So we look forward to her valuable insights and expertise today. Before commencing this session, I would like to inform our participants that the chat will remain closed during the discussion with our esteemed panelists, but it will be open once the discussion has concluded. After the discussion with the panelists, we will move into an open discussion where you will have the opportunity to share your thoughts and ask questions. So it is now my pleasure to hand over the floor to Ms. Senanayaka, who will be leading us in today's session on faith and ethics in climate policy. Ms. Senanayaka, the floor is yours to briefly explain today's topic before we move into the discussion.
Absolutely. Firstly, I wanted to thank everyone for joining in. Actually, I requested for a last minute time change. I asked for a couple of minutes extra. That is because I must disclaim that I'm not joining from Sri Lanka. So I was moving to the hostel that I'm currently staying in. And I think it's a little timely and perhaps even a little funny that when I'm doing this webinar from where I am, I'm currently in Florence, Italy. It's because there was a conference that took place just a couple of days ago. It finished on the 24th. And I'll use that conference as a segue to explain why and what I'm talking about. So the conference was actually organized by Wilton Park. Wilton Park is a wing of the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which brings different actors in the development sector for the purposes of setting up associations, networks, coalitions, and to drive collaboration for sustainable development. And the most recent chapter of Wilton Park Dialogue focused on setting up an international network of women faith leaders who are fighting for climate change. So I would be bringing in a lot of input and learnings from that particular conference or that particular event. And I think that event also highlights how the world is now progressively realizing that solving the climate crisis, I'm getting tongue-tied for some reason, solving the climate crisis isn't a top-down approach anymore, where we rely on governmental actors, where we rely on state actors to solve this issue, and that we, one, need to use a bottom-to-top approach, which I will explain later in the discussion, and we also need to engage as many actors as possible. And one of the communities that are now progressively getting space, especially within international conferences, are faith-based actors. So today we're going to talk about what faith-based climate change activism is, what are the ethics surrounding faith-based climate activism, and how we really can get involved, how we really can get these stakeholders involved, rather, in the process of climate policy formulation and climate governance. So that's what we will be talking about today. And I also wanted to thank Ms. Inoka, because she was very kind enough to actually accommodate a more conversational approach to this presentation, as opposed to a more seminar-based approach to the presentation or webinar-based approach. And I'm truly grateful for that. So thank you so much. Inoka, you're actually on mute. They couldn't hear you.
Thank you, Ms. Senanayaka. So we will be having a discussion today instead of going through a PowerPoint presentation. So in our discussion, we will center around 5 main topics, which are identifying faith-based climate actors, the ethics of climate advocacy, scope of climate policy, the role of state policy sector, and steps for advocacy. So let's start with defining faith-based climate actors. Who do you think they are, and what might their roles involve in climate action? You're
Awesome.
muted.
This time I am muted. So this happens a lot because you mute so that the background noise doesn't affect and you completely forget about it. I think this is an interesting entry point into the conversation to first understand who faith-based actors are in terms of climate change and climate advocacy. And why I think it is interesting is because when in my previous webinar on the role of faith in climate advocacy, I spoke extensively about. I apologize for the background noise. I'm actually near a window in the hostel that I'm staying in, so please excuse any background noise. And you know, in Italy, they drive fast bikes, so you probably will hear the throttle. So coming back to what I was saying, we see how if I was to refer back to the webinar that I had previously, there I spoke about how faith and climate advocacy are very much interlinked, purely because if you take a look at any faith system or any religious system, they've all advocated for protecting what is called the common home, being the earth and its natural environment. So from, let's say, Lord Buddha attaining enlightenment under a Bodhi tree to the Garden of Eden, which is the home of Adam and Eve, described in the Bible and spoken about in the other Abrahamic religions also, like Islam and Judaism, you really see how nature plays quite a role in terms of serving as the home within which all faith systems are founded and all faith systems are felt. So if you take a look at faith as a human experience, climate change is very much interlinked to that, or climate protection is very much linked to that, because to advocate for spirituality means to actually advocate for protecting one's own natural environment. So extending upon that link, now that we know that faith and climate advocacy are very much interlinked, the next sort of thing that I focused on last week is how different faith groups from churches in Ethiopia to the Brahmic farming system in India, to how different faith groups are actually collectively working to change the approach to climate advocacy from being very state dependent, from being dependent on the United Nations system, to being far more localized. So I think that is a sort of a linkage between what I spoke about in the previous webinar and what I will be speaking about today. And I think that base introduction is important because when we are talking about faith-based climate advocacy and faith-based climate advocates, we really see that we are really talking about quite a large spectrum of people. And why I say that is because as I explained in my previous webinar also, there is a fundamental difference between faith and religion. So we know that faith is a more personal experience and it has a lot to do with being guided by one's belief system. So it could involve being part of an organized religion to even practicing meditative techniques, practicing loving kindness to everyone, being agnostic, being atheist. So faith is a far more broader sort of approach. But the idea is that if you're part of a faith group, you are part of a group that has common identity factors, versus religion is a far more organized process where you have a hierarchy, you have an institution, and you also have a system to bring a congregation together. So when we talk about faith, I wanted to clarify, and faith-based actors, I wanted to clarify, we're not just talking about organized religions and organized religious institutions. So it's naturally a very broad conversation. So what do we mean when we say faith-based climate advocates? We're talking about climate advocates, both institutional, group, and individual. So we're talking about those who actually believe that one's faith system is necessary, or promoting spirituality is necessary to advocate for climate change, or perhaps to not advocate for climate change, but advocate against climate change, or to advocate for environmental protection. So it could be the case, if I'm to give a couple of examples, if you actually have a small, let's say, a mosque in a village that is speaking about the fact that the Almighty Allah actually created the natural environment, and it is a gift that has been given to humanity by the Creator Himself. That is an example of a faith-based climate advocate, or perhaps a faith-based climate advocacy institution. So that is an institutional example. But moving away from that, let's say you have a situation where there is another church in a community that has a youth congregation, and they are getting together to organize something like a Shramadana. So Shramadana is, if I'm not mistaken, it's a Pali word that's found in a lot of South Asian languages, but the idea of Shramadana means to give one's voluntary service. Let's say they get together and they decide to clean up garbage around a lake near their church. Those young people who are part of the youth group of the church are also faith-based climate actors. So that's an example of a group. But then another example of a non-organized faith-based group is, let's say you have a yogic meditation center where you can actually join that meditation center without aligning to Hinduism or without aligning to an organized religion. So you just come and you actually be part of the natural environment, and you are part of that group because you want to connect spiritually to the natural environment. Let's say in that group that you organize a conversation or a panel discussion for the local people in their local languages on climate conservation. That's also an example of a faith-based climate advocate, a group-based example. And finally, another individual example of a faith-based climate advocate is someone who is a spiritual leader like the Dalai Lama, or perhaps even it doesn't have to be someone who is a leader who is the top of his faith-based system, but even you and I who actually believe in a faith system can be, and who derive inspiration from our faith systems, can be considered to be faith-based climate actors. So I wanted to talk about this entire spectrum of people because it's really important to understand that when you're talking about faith-based climate advocacy, we're not only talking about religious climate advocacy, and secondly, we're also not only talking about institutions, we're also talking about groups, and we're speaking about individuals as well. So you have quite a spectrum of people that need to be included in climate advocacy spaces so that they can contribute to the best of their capacities to this very universal cause.
Thank you, Ms. Senanayaka. There is one more thing I need to, I need your understanding on this. How do we see faith-based actors engaging at the community level? You have already explained a bit on that. Oh, and do they have a unique advantage in reaching certain demographics?
Absolutely. So I think a perfect example that I can use to engage with this question is one that I learned from the Wilton Park Dialogue. So I met this amazing activist called Aisha from Cameroon. She's actually a Muslim woman by faith and by religion, and she's part of this group or this organization that actually works with 350 indigenous tribes in Cameroon for the purposes of conserving Central African forests. So I wanted to open with that example purely because that I think is a fantastic example of what we call intersectional advocacy. What I mean by that is, there is advocacy that is very much focused on a particular cause. Like, for example, let's say you are advocating for digital rights. Digital rights is specific to the digital realm. But let's say you are focusing on digital rights at the intersection of giving women more inclusive spaces in the internet, then that's a more intersectional approach where you bring different dimensions together in your advocacy. So the example I brought up before is very intersectional because you have a woman of an organized religion who is actually engaging with indigenous communities for the purposes of forest conservation. So you have climate advocacy, indigenous rights conservation and promotion, and also religious activism at play together. And that example is helpful for us to understand why faith-based actors are actually, in my opinion, the most unique in terms of really pushing forward the climate advocacy agenda or the climate conservation agenda. So recently, the head of the United Nations Environmental Program, he actually made a very interesting statement, and this was in line with the COP summit that's happening in Azerbaijan. And what he basically said was that we have actually moved away from thinking about climate advocacy as a very top-down engagement where you have states leading the fight, where you have the international development sector leading the fight. We have moved away from that thinking, and now the United Nations Environmental Program is looking to engage with more community level actors. And one of the key community level actors they have actually chosen for that purpose are faith-based groups. And the rationale for this is that if you take a look at faith-based groups, why faith-based groups are the best actors for community level engagement and community level awareness creation on climate change is because one, faith is actually very much a part of a community's identity. May it be an indigenous community who believes in Mother Earth as a god or tree gods, or may it be really, as I mentioned before, a self-sustaining agricultural society that doesn't subscribe to one religion, but believes in the faith of loving kindness, or even it could be the case that you are purely part of a minority religious group that's advocating for conserving, let's say, a protected forest in your area, whatever it is. In all three of these instances, what you see is that faith actually plays a role in terms of serving as an identity factor and bringing everyone together. So one, it is an identity factor, and two, it's also a connecting factor. It has this amazing potential to mobilize communities. And the third thing is, faith is also important because since it speaks to the soul of a person is more likely to be convinced by faith-based communication. Because if you take a look at the existing research and the existing statistics, we actually see that close to 83% of people in the world subscribe to some sort of faith system or religion. So we're talking about the ability to tap in 83% of the world's population and shifting their awareness, shifting their activism towards climate conservation and environmental conservation, climate engagement, sorry, and environmental conservation. So we really see that faith has the ability to convince, which is the third characteristic. The fourth characteristic is faith systems already have large amounts of resources at their disposal, right? So if you're talking about, for example, let's say a country where you have 60 million Christian population and you have 60,000 churches, we are talking about 60,000 buildings in which conversations about climate conservation can happen, right? So we're talking about a commune, the ability to have resources is another reason as to why faith actors are so effective on the ground. And the final reason is because of the networks that faith-based systems have. And these networks, mappings on faith-based networks actually show us that faith-based networks and the impact of those networks are so diverse because they have connections to international actors and they also have connections to local actors. Like, for example, let's say if you take a look at Sri Lanka as an example, I know we have international participants here, but we know that the Archbishop of Colombo has direct contacts to the Vatican here. So that's an international connection. But at the same time, the Archbishop is very close to the priests that are working on the ground as well. So that diversity of networks is actually very useful in terms of faith actors being active in the community to promote climate engagement.
Thank you, Ms. Senanak. Actually, our previous webinar was on traditional knowledge and indigenous people's rights in terms of climate change. So what you said is like, it's very much interconnected. I think the participants also must be, having some connection of all those things. So thank you so much for your comprehensive explanation. So now let's move on to the ethics of climate advocacy. Climate advocacy is inherently ethical, but what unique ethical considerations do you think faith-based actors should or do bring to this movement?
Sure. So I think if you take a look at ethics of advocacy in general, like the fact that you are actually fighting for a cause bigger than yourself, who are fighting for equality, common ethics like that also apply in climate advocacy. But what makes climate advocacy very unique and what sort of the ethics of climate advocacy, especially faith-based groups champion, one is I've noticed, as we're working with faith-based groups, what I've noticed is faith-based conversation on climate change is far more inclusive than secular conversation on climate change. So let me explain the difference between the two. Now, with faith-based actors taking more and more space within the macro climate advocacy system, like at it could be at COP, or it could be at the World Parliament of Religions, or it could be at different UN conferences on climate. With more faith-based actors taking up contribution and taking up spaces for contribution, what you really see is that climate conversation is now being divided into two, as faith-based conversation and secular conversation. So what we mean by that is secular conversation or secular dialogue on climate advocacy really focuses on getting non-faith institutions like state institutions, intergovernmental institutions, or it could even be community institutions that are not driven by faith, getting them involved or allowing them to take leadership in climate advocacy. Versus faith-based climate conversation or dialogue, as the name suggests itself, looks at how faith and faith-based groups can be utilized as a strength point for climate advocacy. So when I've actually, having participated in both these types of conversation and advocacy environments, one key ethic that faith-based groups always champion in climate advocacy is inclusiveness. And what I mean by that is, because it is the politics of faith-based climate advocacy is different from secular climate advocacy, you really see that faith climate advocacy isn't always a battle for power, versus secular climate advocacy has a lot to do with engaging with very political actors, from states to big businesses, right? So one of the ethics I've always seen in faith-based climate advocacy is inclusiveness. The fact that you create an environment in which you try to be mutually respectful of the other person's viewpoint. And this is especially important, in my opinion, in faith-based climate advocacy, where purely because you have different faith systems with differing views on how the world was created, on our purposes of existence, etc. So it is a tricky environment for sure, because you have people who believe in the world being created by a single God sitting on the same table as, let's say, a philosophical Buddhist who does not believe in that same concept, right? So in such a situation, navigating this is a little bit tricky, but one of the key ethics that I see now being promoted in faith-based conversation is inclusiveness through mutual respect. So we must make sure that any faith-based climate advocacy is inclusive and based on mutual respect, especially of differing faith systems. Then the second ethic that we need to promote is trying and creating a mindset of what we call the common home. So this is actually very common or very popular advocacy lingua in faith-based climate advocacy. What we mean by common home is it's basically recognizing the earth as being the only home available to mankind as we know it in this particular sort of galaxy, I suppose, because I don't want to get into the sciences behind whether there are other planets that are habitable, whether there are extraterrestrial beings. But as far as we know now, we know that Earth is the only home that's available to us. So recognizing the fact that Earth is our home and that it is collectively shared by all of us, recognizing the ethics of a common home is also something that's very important in faith-based climate advocacy. Then the third thing that you need to champion when you are a faith-based climate advocate, in my opinion, is equality amongst all beings. I spoke about this in the previous webinar also, but one of the key and one of the, perhaps in my opinion, one of the most unique features of faith-based climate advocacy, unlike secular advocacy, is that faith-based climate advocacy recognizes animals, plants, and human beings as being equal organisms. I've never heard that conversation come up in secular advocacy, because secular advocacy focuses on funding, it focuses on reducing the carbon footprint, it focuses on directing state efforts. You have that same conversation happening in faith-based advocacy also, but it's more geared, the language is more geared towards recognizing that animals, human beings, and trees, and the planet as a whole is one inclusive ecosystem. So that's the third ethic. And then the fourth ethic that I have actually also seen is basically equality in terms of, now previously I spoke about interspecies equality as an ethic. The fourth thing that I'm going to speak about is how you have inter-stakeholder equality. What I mean by that is, unlike secular climate conversation, faith-based climate conversation one is predominantly led by women. This is very an interesting and a unique feature of it, because a lot of the actors who are engaging on the ground are women. If you take a look at the Christian missionary movement, it's the sisters that are leading this fight. Then if you take a look at the Buddhist movement, for example, it's actually communities led by female monks in the Southeast Asia that are leading this fight. So another unique aspect and ethic that I've seen is promoting inclusiveness among stakeholders. It's led by women predominantly. And another thing you see is you have actors of all ages. So you have those who are young, who are like in their 15, who are 15, 16, who are in school, and you have very seasoned actors like who are 70, who are also contributing to the cause. And I saw this in the recent event I went to as well. So there was a very young Indian climate activist who was 17 years of age. And there was also the former Prime Minister of Ireland, who is Mary Robinson, who actually was also there, who was present, and she leads Project Dandelion. So you see a spectrum of inclusivity in terms of gender, in terms of age, etc. So those are the four ethics that I see being promoted and I think should be promoted.
Great. Thank you so much for your great explanation. So now let's move on to the understanding the scope of climate policy. So the climate policy covers a wide range of topics and actions. How would you describe the scope of climate policy, and what should faith-based actors understand about its components?
Sure. So when we mean policy, especially climate policy, unlike national policy, is something that takes place at different levels. So policies now, or the conversation about policy in the international development sector, is progressively moving away from parliaments of countries taking up policies and moving towards a more multi-level approach, moving towards frameworks and moving towards systems. So what we mean by the term climate policy is we are talking about any framework that has been set up or is planned to be set up for the purposes of pushing forward the climate agenda. So it could be, let's say, when a national government adopts a 5-year plan to increase natural forest coverage by 5%, or let's say there is that is an example of climate policy. When the European Union actually adopted its Forest Act, we really saw its Natural Forest Act. We really saw how that was a phenomenal sort of achievement, because that the European Union was the first regional organization to go beyond rainforest conservation to talk about other smaller ecosystems like swamp conservation and sort of city forest conservation, etc. Then that's an example of regional advocacy. Then you also have international advocacy, like one of the key sort of focus points of international climate advocacy now in terms of policy making is the impact of climate change on forced migration, right? And the impact of climate change on migration itself. So to share across like a personal anecdote of something that I learned. So recently, like to give you just an example of how diverse it can be, what we mean by climate policy. But this is an example of where the government actually, the governments involved, the international development sector involved is failing the community that I'm speaking about. So one of the most horrific tragedies that the world unfortunately isn't talking about right now is the difficulty that the Rohingya people are facing in Myanmar. But when you actually speak to members of the Rohingya community, we really see who are in Bangladesh now, we really see that during monsoon season, during flooding season, their camps are constantly underwater. And I'm not even someone who is suitable to speak about this, but I just wanted to just draw attention to that. But let's say there is international commitment to really deal with intersectional issues like that. That is also climate policy, because climate policy, through the example that I brought to you, it really shows us how intersectional it can be, how interdisciplinary it can be, because climate affects everything from industries to migration to gender. So when we're talking about climate policy, we're talking about it at a multi-level, and we're talking about it horizontally being broad as well. The fact that it involves every single aspect of human existence. So this has also made climate policy very challenging. And I think with that observation, I'll go into the second part of your question. I think one difficulty that a lot of faith-based climate advocates and even secular climate advocates are facing is with the sustainable development goals and with sustainable development coming in as a concept and being popularized as a concept, one of the biggest issues we have is that climate policy making is becoming far too broad, to a point where before it used to be about a few things. It used to be about increasing our natural forest coverage to prevent biodiversity loss. It also used to be about reducing our carbon footprint. And the third thing it was about is actually protecting indigenous environmental cultures and ecosystems. But now it's become so broad and so interlinked that policies are, according to a lot of experts, not addressing the issues, at least the basics issues of climate change. So perhaps one difficult point that you and I would have to face in the climate policy sector, and faith-based advocates would have to face in the climate policy sector, is navigating how broad it has become. And the second thing that they would have to face, of course, is looking at and battling institutions that believe that policy should only be passed by states and policies should only be passed by governments. Trust me, there are enough and more governments, including the government of Sri Lanka, based on personal experience, I would tell you, that believes that policy is the responsibility of the government. And they have consistently told us this. So when you have states that aren't really opening up policy spaces, that's one challenge that faith-based groups are going to battle with, especially because climate policy in many countries aren't even open to secular organizations. So to get it open for faith organizations is going to require a larger push. Then the third sort of and the final sort of thing that I would say that faith-based actors need to be on the lookout for in terms of climate advocacy is really pushing for, or perhaps really asking for, a seat at the table. Because it's especially at a national level, even though in UN conferences, faith-based actors are getting equal space, you don't have national policy-making systems giving enough space for faith-based climate actors. So those are three things that, in my opinion, or challenges that they would have to be on the lookout for.
Okay, thank you. So now let's explore the state's role. So, what responsibilities do you think state policy sectors have in engaging faith-based climate actors? I think it's one of the very vital roles. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that question. So I think it perfectly links to what I said before. Actually, if you really think about it, the no matter how much, I think I said this in the previous webinar also, no matter how much individuals try to do their part, even if we stop using plastic straws and buy a metal straw that we use every time, or even if, let's say, we actually stop using polythene bags and take a tote bag to the supermarket. Not saying that they don't matter, it does matter, it very much matters. But what I'm trying to say here is the all of those little actions are crucially important, but the impact of those actions sometimes are completely overhauled when you have prime ministers using personal jets that burn, let's say, thousands and thousands of fossil fuel when they take one single sort of ride to a UN conference, right? Or when you have you know how many celebrities came under fire for using private jets unnecessarily. So when you have powerful actors not actually doing their part, it becomes extremely difficult for conscientious citizens like you and I, who are here at this particular conversation, to do their part also. Why I started with that bleak note is because I really believe that unless and otherwise states actually do their part, climate change is going to be very difficult to stop. Because so you have very left-wing climate advocates who believe that the only way we can stop the climate crisis is by getting rid of governments and having a self-governing society. But in my opinion, that level of revolution is not sustainable, because we know that you and I aren't ready to self-govern ourselves, and people are very much attracted by power, and it's going to be survival of the fittest. So we can't get rid of governments. So if we can't get rid of governments, governments themselves need to recognize that we need you and that we need you to also do your part. So I opened up with that statement because states actually are perhaps the leading actors, along with multinational corporations now, that have to play their part in terms of environmental conservation. And one way that they can play the part is by actually opening up their policy spaces to faith-based actors. And in my opinion, this is something that's not difficult to do. And why I say that is because every single government, in whatever shape or form, has some sort of environmental engagement framework. It might be developed at, or it might be fully fledged at different levels from country to country, but there is some sort of basic framework. So the first thing that states can actually do to make their policy systems inclusive to faith-based actors is to, one, recognize formally that faith-based actors are actually important in their climate strategies and in their climate policies. And this actually can be done in multiple ways again. But one thing that they can do to officially recognize is to say that, to actually invite faith-based actors to create, like, let's say, a list of 30 to 40 or even 100 organizations based on how large the country is, of faith-based actors that the state wants to actually officially get involved, and come up with a consortium or a coalition of faith-based actors in that country. So once they come up with a coalition, the next step that they can follow is to get the coalition to appoint a group of representatives that sort of represent the main faith systems in that country. And these representatives, in my opinion, shouldn't just be spiritual leaders or religious leaders. They should also be people with expertise and knowledge in terms of environmental sciences, in terms of environmental conservation. Because it's going to be ineffective to have a spiritual leader who's just going to come and talk about how, let's say, in the Bible or something, the environmental conservation is spoken about. That contribution isn't enough. That is not what we mean by faith-based climate policy advocacy, because preaching about one's faith system is not faith-based climate policy advocacy in a policy setting. We actually require those with expertise, but also coming from a spiritual point of view, to be appointed as representatives to these policy spaces. And once they're appointed, once this consortium is set up and these representatives are appointed, the next thing the state has to do is, the state basically has to reserve seats for these representatives in their policy systems. Like, before passing a climate policy, before passing a climate strategy, they have to consult with these faith-based representatives. And another thing that they can do is, once the consultation is done and input has been obtained, then they can keep engaging with these actors throughout the policy formulation cycle. And once they adopt the policy itself, the next thing that they just need to do is to give this policy to the faith-based actors and request for their help in localizing it. Because one of the biggest problems in the global south that we have is, we have over policy making. We have enough policies, especially even in climate change or even climate related policy. We have documents that are called the climate policy of country X. But our biggest issue is, it's not being localized. The objectives of it are not being fulfilled. So the unique position, in my opinion, of faith-based climate actors that the state has to realize is, not only are they a knowledge ecosystem, not only are they a policy stakeholder, they're also a localization actor. Like, they can really help you push through policies locally. So that's how, in my opinion, states have to engage with faith-based climate actors, and why they should do it.
Thank you. It was a very thorough explanation. So
Sorry.
since we have spoken about all the things, I think now it's time to move on to the actionable steps. So what practical steps can faith-based groups take to advocate effectively for climate policy? It has to be effective also. So that's why I specifically mentioned the word effectively.
Yes, absolutely. Because I mean, I really hope that I understand where Inuka's coming from. Like, the webinar has to give some sort of a takeaway that these actors themselves can actually localize. So I would like to speak about what faith-based groups can do in 4 main dimensions. I've already spoken about policy and systems dimension, but one key dimension, in my opinion, that faith-based actors need to work in is community level, the community level dimension, right? And Inuka, correct me if I'm wrong, you want me to provide input in terms of how faith-based actors can work with policy systems or work at a multi-level?
Can be both. It can be both ways, because it has to be the practical steps, you know. We have seen
Sure.
in so many forums that people are only talking about those topics, but
Yeah.
there weren't any practical steps being taken.
Sure. I just wanted to make that clarification so I don't actually misdirect the participants. So, having understood the purpose of the question, let me say this. When we are talking about faith-based engagement in policy, especially climate policy, I would say faith groups need to engage in climate policy mainly based on their current capacity. And why I say that is because a lot of small faith-based communities that I have spoken to, especially indigenous faith-based communities, they tend to stay away from policy making purely because they believe they don't have the resources to send their representatives to international policy spaces, purely because they believe they're not large enough for the government to actually listen to them. And there are different factors that discourage them from engaging with policy actors, right? But I said that because I want to acknowledge the fact that no matter how small you are as in, so not that I think we phrased that the wrong way, no matter how small in numbers the faith-based group is and small in sort of limited in resources it is, it shouldn't sort of discourage you from participating. Why I say that is because policy advocacy, especially at a national level, isn't just about engaging with the government, isn't just about engaging with the parliament, if I can specialize it even more. You don't have to sit alongside parliamentarians and contribute to really contribute to climate policy. That isn't the only way that's available. Why I say that is because if you take a look at a lot of climate policy structures in countries, climate policy decision making mainly happens at the subnational level. And why I say that is because I think there was I think someone got disconnected and the recording stopped. I just wanted to bring that to Ms. Inoga's attention also. But moving away from that, I wanted to say that if you take a look at any country, most countries really, climate policy making and implementation and climate decision making happens at a subnational level. So if I was to again use Sri Lanka as an example, even though the parliament of the country will actually adopt the country's climate policy, we haven't had a climate policy for a long time, by the way. But let's say if the parliament does adopt a climate policy, the budgetary allocations in Sri Lanka for climate conservation goes to the provincial councils. I think it is the same case in a lot of other global south countries. So US, if you're a part of a faith community, even if you can't access the parliament system, you can still access your provincial councils and subnational systems. And there are multiple ways of doing that, in my opinion. It doesn't just have to be where you, for example, protest outside of the parliament. That is one direct way of engaging with traditional climate activism. But another way that, in my opinion, we don't exercise is holding your local governmental leaders accountable. When was the last time you and I, as faith based actors or as part of a faith based group, wrote a letter to our provincial council minister or our Gram Nadari officer, alerting them about some sort of environmental advocacy issue or environmental policy issue in our area? So, in my opinion, one of the untapped resources that we are not using currently is actually our national leadership. I understand, I'm sure many of you are thinking our provincial council ministers are thugs or our Gram Nidari officers barely give us time. Like these are real issues that, people in the global south face. But even then, I believe that we shouldn't give up on the system because the system is essential for us to go forward. So one practical tip I can give you is to engage with your subnational actors. Then another practical tip that I can give you is every subnational governmental institution in most countries have an environmental officer. So it could be in the form of an additional secretary. It could be in the form of, let's say, some sort of attachee to the provincial council or the subnational councils. But every institution has an environmental actor, an environmental officer. So it's necessary for faith-based institutions working locally to form a sustainable relationship with this environmental officer. One biggest issue that we have when we talk to faith-based systems working on the ground, they don't even know that there is an environmental officer that is actually acting or working in the subnational level. So that's the second practical tip that I can give you. Then the third practical tip that I can give you as faith-based systems or faith-based groups is to use your congregation as the most effective platform for policy engagement. What I mean by that is, it is possible for, based on the networks that you have, for you to actually invite policymakers to your congregation, to your temples, to sit down and to speak to the people of your congregation, to ask them about the issues that they're facing. Right? So, for example, I'll tell you one example of something that we did. Last year, we actually had the South Asian Conference on Higher Legal Education and Sustainable Development. And one of our key invitees was Uru Alige Vanileto from the Adivasi people. So we actually had him speaking about the role of law in climate conservation. And it was after that, our chief guest was the former Minister of Justice. It was only after seeing his contributions that the Minister of Justice actually ended up visiting the Adivasi people, speaking to the Adivasi people and asking, what are your laws? So that really shows you how you really need to bring the policymakers to you to get their attention. And it is possible to actually do that. It's difficult, but it is still possible. So I would say it's using your congregation and your own religious systems as a platform for climate advocacy is also a sort of a practical input that I wanted to give. Then the final thing I wanted to highlight is actually using online systems to connect with policymakers. Now, a lot of climate policy conversation actually happens on Twitter. It happens by tagging prime ministers. It happens by tagging environmental ministers. So as faith-based movements, I would say to use social media for climate policy, idea provision, and climate policy engagement. So those are 5 points of practical input that I wanted to share.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Senanayake, for your valuable insights on faith and ethics in climate policy. Actually, your explanations highlighted the importance of faith and ethics in climate policy. So on behalf of everyone, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Ms. Chiranthi Senanayake for sharing such valuable insights and expertise today. Your contributions had made this session not only informative, but also very deeply thought-provoking. We truly appreciate your time and for helping us gain a better understanding of these critical issues. Then again, a heartfelt thanks goes to our audience for their active participation today, and hope to have your engaging questions for the Q&A session as well. And special thank goes to our the participants who will be watching this program through our YouTube channel. So lastly, a special thank goes to our coordinators for their hard work in organizing this successful event. Your efforts behind the scenes made this session possible and impactful. So with that, we will be closing the live session, but the recorded Q&A session will continue afterwards. Thank you for joining us today.